The room was tense, a quiet hum of anticipation hanging in the air as the exchange reached its boiling point. Kamala Harris leaned forward, her tone clipped, her words slicing the atmosphere like glass shattering on marble. She looked Jasmine Crockett dead in the eye and said, with that trademark smirk, "All right, Junior, let's not get ahead of ourselves." The word hung there, Junior. Simple, dismissive, loaded. It wasn't just a label, it was a dagger, sharpened with arrogance and plunged with intention. The chamber seemed to freeze. Eyes darted around. Some smirked, others gasped. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't flinch, not a muscle. Her stillness spoke louder than a dozen rebuttals. For one long second, silence reigned. Silence heavy enough to make viewers at home shift in their seats. It was the kind of silence that carries centuries of condescension. Generations of voices told to sit down, wait their turn, know their place. Harris had just thrown the gauntlet, not only at Crockett, but at every young woman, every black voice, every immigrant story daring to rise against the hierarchy of Washington. The cameras zoomed in. Crockett's eyes, calm yet burning, told their own story. She knew what had just happened. The audience knew what had just happened. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was an insult echoing across the nation. And as Harris leaned back in her chair, satisfied, confident she had cut her opponent down to size, something unexpected stirred. A shift, subtle but undeniable, rippled through the air. The energy was no longer in Harris's control. It was moving, gathering, pulling toward Crockett, like the first winds before a storm. Viewers online erupted instantly. Screens lit up with outrage. The word Junior was already trending before the debate even ended. Hashtags were being born in real time. The people watching weren't just observing a political spat, they were witnessing a generational clash, a cultural fault line cracking wide open. Kamala thought she had put Jasmine in her place, but in that very moment, she had done the opposite. She had revealed something raw, something America couldn't ignore. And what happened in the next 30 seconds would leave even the most seasoned politicians stunned. To understand the power of that single word, Junior, we need to step back, because this wasn't just one woman insulting another. This was the voice of an entrenched political order trying to silence a new generation of leaders demanding change. And in America's history, moments like this have always carried more weight than the words themselves. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that chamber as a political insider. She didn't come with the sheen of old money, the backing of dynasties, or the privilege of a family name carved into marble. She came with grit, with scars, with the weight of communities who had been told time and again to wait their turn. That was the fire in her voice, the reason people tuned in to hear her speak. She represented something Harris could never embody, unpolished authenticity. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, had built her career on image, polished speeches, well-rehearsed lines, practiced smiles. To some, she was a symbol of progress. To others, she was the embodiment of politics as usual. But the dismissive words she hurled across that room revealed something deeper, an instinct to maintain hierarchy, to remind the outsiders where they belonged. The stakes, then, were enormous. This wasn't a personal clash, it was a cultural one. Generational, symbolic. It was about who gets to define what leadership in America looks like. Is it the carefully groomed insider with decades of connections, or the rising voice unafraid to rattle the cage? Is it the politician who dismisses with a smirk, or the fighter who listens with patience and strikes with precision? The audience felt it in their bones. Young people, watching from their phones and laptops, saw in Jasmine a reflection of themselves. Underestimated, dismissed, told they weren't ready. Immigrant families, watching around dinner tables, felt the sting of that word Junior, remembering every moment their voices had been minimized. Black women across the nation recognized the age-old tactic, diminishment disguised as politeness, arrogance cloaked in civility. And yet, there was something more dangerous happening beneath the surface. Kamala Harris believed she was in control. She believed this was her arena, her script, her spotlight. But the insult she had just delivered wasn't closing the chapter, it was opening a door to a confrontation that would soon spiral beyond her grasp. Because when arrogance tries to silence authenticity, history shows us something powerful. Authenticity fights back, and when it doesn't just speak, it roars. At that moment, viewers weren't just asking, what will Jasmine Crockett say next? They were asking something bigger. What does this mean for the future of American politics? And if Harris thought her words had ended the debate, she was about to discover a truth that shook her foundation. She had just set the stage for her own unraveling. But what came next wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a history lesson, a record, a truth so sharp it would pierce through the polished armor Harris had spent decades building. Kamala Harris did not arrive on the national stage as a mystery. She arrived as a story, a carefully crafted one. The daughter of immigrants, a prosecutor who rose quickly through the ranks, and eventually a senator who embodied, at least on paper, the promise of American diversity. She was polished, articulate, a force in debates when lines landed just right. For years, that image was her shield. But beneath the polish, beneath the practiced gestures and carefully chosen sound bites, cracks had always existed. Her record as a prosecutor was one of those cracks. To her supporters, she was tough on crime. To her critics, she was overly harsh, too willing to protect the system rather than reform it. Questions followed her. How many families were torn apart by her policies? How many young men of color, who could have been redirected toward opportunity, instead found themselves trapped in cycles of incarceration because of her office's choices? For every applause line in her speeches, there were whispers of contradiction. And then came her rise to the Senate. Harris positioned herself as a progressive, a fighter for justice. But her votes and her silence often told another story. She branded herself as bold, yet too often appeared cautious. She styled herself as fearless, yet avoided risks when the cameras were off. It was this duality, this constant dance between ambition and authenticity, that made her vulnerable. Still, for years, Harris carried herself as untouchable. Her laughter could disarm. Her sharp questioning in Senate hearings made viral clips that trended for days. She leaned into the image of the fearless prosecutor, the woman who could stand toe-to-toe with powerful men and cut them down with a glance. That image was intoxicating, and for a while, it worked. But politics is cruel to those who rely too much on image. When the lights of the 2020 Democratic primary burned hot, Harris's contradictions were magnified. The lofty promises collided with a record that told a different story. The boldness fizzled when pressed on substance. Crowds that once leaned forward in excitement began to lean back in doubt. Her campaign, once seen as a juggernaut, collapsed before the first votes were even cast. Yet Harris remained. Through calculation, through connections, through the careful alignment of power, she became vice president. It was an achievement, historic, without question. But for many, it also symbolized the political machine rewarding ambition over authenticity, and that machine breeds arrogance. That arrogance was on full display when she looked Jasmine Crockett in the eye and spat out the word junior. It wasn't just an insult, it was a reflex. It was the instinct of someone who had spent years climbing ladders, pulling them up behind her, and reminding others of their place. To Harris, Crockett was not an equal. She was a reminder of the younger, hungrier politician Harris, once pretended to be and could no longer convincingly embody. The irony was bitter. Harris, who had once been the underestimated outsider, now played the role of gatekeeper. The immigrant daughter who had fought for recognition now told another woman of color. She was too small, too unseasoned, too junior to matter. It was not just hypocrisy, it was betrayal. Betrayal of the very narrative Harris had built her career on. And the people watching knew it. Every camera captured the smirk, the condescension. Social media clipped it within seconds. The comment sections boiled with frustration. How dare she? How quickly power forgets its roots. Kamala Harris believed the moment belonged to her. That with a single word, she had reminded everyone who held the authority in that room. But arrogance blinds. What she didn't see was the tide shifting beneath her. The audience wasn't applauding her confidence. They were recoiling from it. They weren't impressed by her dominance. They were disgusted by it. And in that disgust, something else stirred. Anticipation. Anticipation for a response. For a counterpunch. For someone to finally pierce the armor of Kamala Harris's carefully manufactured persona. Because across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, not a polished insider, not someone rehearsed to play the game, but someone who had lived the struggles Harris once claimed to fight for. Crockett was not smirking. She was not rattled. She was waiting. And that wait, the calm before her storm, was more powerful than anything Harris had prepared for. Because what Harris didn't realize was this. In trying to diminish Crockett, she had handed her the microphone, and once Crockett began to speak, there would be no taking it
Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in marble halls or elite boardrooms. It begins in the neighborhoods of Dallas, where opportunity was scarce but determination ran deep. Born into a working-class family, she learned early what it meant to fight for every inch, to stretch every dollar, to carry the weight of responsibility long before her peers. As a child, Crockett was no stranger to being underestimated. Teachers, officials, even neighbors sometimes saw her through a narrow lens, too bold, too outspoken, too unwilling to fall in line. But what others called too much, she knew was the very thing that would carry her forward, the fire in her chest that refused to dim. She carried that fire into school, into college, into law. Unlike the polished climb of establishment politicians, Crockett's path was paved with obstacles. She worked multiple jobs, supported family, studied by dim light when others slept. While Harris built a resume in elite circles, Crockett was in courtrooms defending the poor, the overlooked, the voiceless. She didn't enter law to climb ladders, she entered it to hold them steady for others. And it was in those battles, standing beside clients who could barely afford her, facing off against a system rigged against them, that she found her voice. She learned that justice wasn't a slogan, it was survival. Every case was personal. Every win carried the weight of lives restored, and every loss cut deep. When she ran for office, few insiders took her seriously. They dismissed her campaign as symbolic, a local fight without consequence. But Jasmine Crockett had been underestimated before, and every time she had turned doubt into momentum. Community by community, block by block, she built something real. Not a brand, not a polished image, a movement, a chorus of people who saw themselves in her, who believed that someone who had lived their struggles might finally carry their voice to the halls of power. Her victory wasn't just political, it was cultural. It was proof that authenticity could triumph over machinery. Proof that a woman from modest beginnings, unapologetically herself, could break through barriers designed to keep people like her out. And when she arrived in Washington, she didn't trade in her fire for politeness. She didn't bend her voice to sound like the old guard. She brought the same grit, the same unapologetic truth-telling, the same willingness to call out hypocrisy, no matter how uncomfortable it made the room. That's what made her dangerous to someone like Kamala Harris, because Crockett wasn't there to play the game. She wasn't there to wait her turn. She wasn't there to be patted on the head, told to bide her time, or politely shuffled to the sidelines. She was there to confront power, to demand accountability, to speak not with rehearsed lines, but with the raw weight of lived experience. Her supporters saw it instantly. They rallied not just around her policies, but around her presence. She carried herself like someone who had nothing to prove to the establishment, and everything to prove to the people who had sent her there. Every speech, every vote, every fiery exchange in a committee hearing was another reminder. This was not politics as usual. This was a new voice, unfiltered, unafraid, and that is why the moment Harris called her junior carried such resonance. To dismiss Jasmine Crockett as unworthy, as lesser, as naive, was to dismiss every community that had fought to put her in that seat. It was to dismiss the families she had defended in courtrooms, the neighborhoods she had marched through, the sacrifices she had endured. It was arrogance colliding head-on with authenticity. Crockett knew it. You could see it in her eyes that night. She had heard worse insults before, slurs, dismissals, backhanded compliments designed to cut her down. But this was different. This was public. This was on a stage where millions were watching, and in that moment, she carried not only her own dignity, but the dignity of everyone who had ever been told, "You're too young, too unprepared, too unworthy." What Harris thought was a put-down was, in truth, a gift, a spark, a trigger that would awaken the very power Crockett had been building her entire life. Because Jasmine didn't need to shout, she didn't need to smirk, she didn't need to interrupt. She had learned the value of patience, of letting arrogance overplay its hand. She waited. She listened. She was absorbed. And when the moment came for her to speak, it would not be with pettiness, but with precision. not with arrogance, but with truth, not with a smirk, but with the weight of history. That night, as Harris sat smug and satisfied, believing she had reminded Jasmine Crockett of her place, she didn't realize the tables were already turning. She had given Crockett the very opening she needed. And Crockett was about to use it, not just to defend herself, but to expose Harris in a way the entire country would remember. Because Jasmine Crockett's story wasn't about waiting her turn. It was about making her turn count. And the countdown had just begun. The debate pressed forward, but the energy in the room had changed. It was no longer the ordinary back and forth of politicians trading talking points. Every word carried the echo of that single insult. Every glance carried the weight of unspoken challenge. Kamala Harris, confident she had seized control, leaned into her performance. Her voice grew sharper, her hand gestures more theatrical. She peppered her statements with polished lines, rehearsed so often they rolled off her tongue like a script she had memorized years ago. She interrupted, pivoted, and tried to drown the moment in her cadence. It was the tactic of someone desperate to reassert dominance, to keep the conversation moving so the insult could fade into the background. But it didn't fade, it lingered. Because Jasmine Crockett refused to take the bait. She didn't scramble to defend herself. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she held her ground with a stillness that drew the audience toward her. The more Harris pushed, the more Crockett seemed to grow in presence. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy, it was patience. And that patience unnerved Harris more than any rebuttal could have. The audience noticed. On television, in living rooms across the country, viewers began whispering, "Why isn't Crockett fighting back yet? What is she waiting for?" Online, comments piled up, "She's letting Harris dig her own grave." Harris, mistaking Crockett's composure for submission, pressed harder. She rattled off statistics, took aim at Crockett's inexperience, and questioned her grasp of policy. Each jab was dressed up as sophistication, but the tone carried condescension. And each time Harris tried to knock her down, Crockett simply listened. That listening became its own power. The camera caught her gaze, steady, unshaken, almost surgical in its calm. She was absorbing every word, cataloging every contradiction, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Tension climbed like a string pulled taut. The crowd leaned in, sensing the shift. Harris's rhythm, once confident, began to falter. Her words spilled faster, her interruptions grew sharper, her attempts at humor landed flat. For the first time, she wasn't just debating an opponent, she was debating herself, her own record looming like a shadow behind every polished line. Crockett finally spoke, not with fire, not with volume, but with clarity. A question, a statement, a gentle but undeniable call-out, the kind of line that pierced through noise and landed squarely in the chest. Harris tried to brush it aside, but her smirk wavered. The balance of power was shifting. The audience felt it. Social media erupted again, this time not just with outrage, but with anticipation. People sensed what was coming, and the tension electrified every second. Because the escalation wasn't about who spoke more, it was about who held control. And for all of Harris's volume, all of her theatrics, she no longer held it. Crockett did. The cameras caught Harris glancing down, searching her notes, her smile just a little too forced. For the first time that night, her confidence cracked, the mask slipped, and the audience saw it. They saw the polished veteran rattled by the calm persistence of the so-called junior Jasmine Crockett didn't need to win the room with theatrics. She already had. And as Harris pressed on, desperately trying to claw back authority, Crockett prepared to deliver something far more devastating than an insult. Because her silence had built suspense. Her composure had set the stage. And now, with Harris overextended and exposed, Crockett was ready. The escalation had reached its peak. The air was thick, every second heavier than the last. And then, at the precise moment when Harris believed she had regained her footing, Crockett began to speak. What followed would not just answer the insult, it would dismantle Harris's entire record. The room was braced for it, though no one could have predicted how it would land. Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward, her voice steady, deliberate, not hurried or heated. She didn't need to raise her volume. Her words carried weight because they came from a place deeper than performance. They came from truth. "You call me Junior," she began, her tone calm, almost conversational. "But I've been fighting for my community long before this stage. And unlike you, I never forgot why I started." The silence that followed was deafening. Harris shifted in her chair, lips tightening, but Crockett pressed on, her cadence deliberate, every pause calculated to let the weight of her words sink in. "You built a career calling yourself a prosecutor for the people. But the people you claim to fight for, the ones in my district, the ones who look like me, the ones who couldn't afford fancy lawyers, they remember you differently.